Europe. Alexis, back to you.
All right, thank you very much, Ashley. Well, President Obama and fellow G20 leaders are following up the United Nations General Assembly with a two-day summit kicking off today in Pittsburgh. Addressing the UN Assembly yesterday, President Obama said the world must come together to solve the global recession.
Those who used to chastise America for acting alone in the world cannot now stand by and wait for America to solve the world's problems alone. We have sought, in word and deed, a new era of engagement with the world.
With the U.S. facing trillion-dollar deficits and a weakening dollar, is it time for the rest of the world to step up to the plate? Or, as the world's most powerful nation, is it still up to us to solve this global crisis? For that, I'm joined by Nariman Behravesh. He is the chief economist for IHS Global, and Brian Dmitrovic. He is the author of Iconoclast, The Rebels Who Sparked the Supply-Side Revolution and Restored American Prosperity. Good morning, gentlemen. Good to see you guys.
Thank you.
Nariman, what do we hope to accomplish at this G20? How much pressure is on the United States?
Well, clearly there's a fair amount of pressure from outside the U.S., but as Mr. Obama said, this is a global problem. It requires a global solution, and I think there are a lot of exporting countries, Germany, China, are hoping the U.S. will come out of this and they can export their way out of trouble. They can't count on that anymore. They can't count on export-led growth anymore. So everybody's got to sort of step up a little bit, maybe boost their domestic demand, boost their consumer spending, especially the Chinese. And so that's what's needed to come up with a comprehensive, sustainable solution to this mega crisis we have on our hands.
So Brian, it's a cross-section of how do we, as members of the G20, lift up our own consumers on our own land, and yet in the same process figure out with the countries that have a surplus as opposed to those who have a deficit, how to work our way out of this crisis?
Alexis, the best thing the United States can do is to grow like a weed. If the United States economy started to grow really fast because of, say, tax cuts and tight money, there would be such a rush to dollar-denominated assets that the whole crisis would evaporate. The most important service the leading nation can provide is to grow quickly.
I want to welcome in, by the way, gentlemen, joining us from Washington, D.C. is Republican Congressman Brian Bilbray of California, who serves on the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Congressman, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. What do you hope to see accomplished in Pittsburgh over the next couple of days?
Well, I hope that the president makes it quite clear, and I hope that everybody who's talking about this new arrangement in the world market and governments understand that they got to stop expecting America to always be doing the heavy lifting. They expect us to go to, Europe when they have problems, Africa, Asia, and we spend more time worrying about places a long ways away than we do in our own backyard, like places like Central America. And I think that we got to quit enabling a lot of our friends to continue to sort of stay away from the table because we end up filling the gap. We need to back off a little bit, allow them to participate, allow them to be engaged. I think we should be engaged everywhere, but I think we got to quit allowing people to expect us always to be the first one in with the most.
Nariman, you agree? A lot of people agree with the congressman.
I do agree, and just to amplify, I think what he said is very similar to what I said, but when it comes to global growth, the U.S. consumer can no longer be the growth engine, if you will, in the sense that U.S. consumers are trying to pay down their debt, they're trying to increase their savings. Other consumers around the world have to step up. But it does mean tax cuts in other countries. It means policies that will help consumer spending in other countries like China, so that the burden doesn't keep falling on us and our consumers.
Brian, the problem with all of this is it's so much easier said than done. It's one thing to say to your next-door neighbor, well, you should focus on your consumer, or you should reconsider your currency, or your export-driven economy. But it doesn't mean that they're going to do it.
Alexis, the funny thing is it's a lot easier than we think it is. As I go over in my book, Iconoclast, every single time in the 20th century there was an economic crisis, and that crisis was met with tight money and tax cuts. There was an immediate, long-lasting boom. If the United States reassured the world of the value of the dollar and then cut taxes in the United States, there would be a boom in the United States that would surge employment and profits throughout the world.
Brian, how do we pay for our deficits if we do that?
Deficits are a piece of cake to finance when the United States is growing like a weed because they're denominated in dollars. And when the dollar is stable or appreciating, everybody wants dollar-denominated assets.
Congressman, you agree with that?
I agree with that and try to sell that in the environment that we have now in Washington, because it's always easy to talk about, well, let's stick it to somebody. Let's, you know, taxes are a way that we make the system more fair by knocking one and giving to another. That's how we get power in Washington. We have to give up the power to do the right thing in Washington, and that's something that Washington doesn't like to do very often, if ever.
Congressman, we're starting a G20 summit in Pittsburgh in the wake of a report today about the weaknesses associated with the TARP program that was put in place 1 year ago. What does that suggest about our ability to orchestrate our way out of a financial collapse?
I think that it points out that we've got to understand that there's a limit to the ability of large bureaucracies to manage large lumps of funds. That's one reason why our founding fathers tried to make sure that as much of this is done locally and in small segments rather than the big package. And that's the biggest problem you're seeing the European Union running into as they move towards our system we've had for 200 years, and that is a unified union rather than separate states. I think that it's a real challenge, and I think we just got to understand there are places for big government, but big government doesn't have a place everywhere. The economy is one of those things, but you just got to be careful. And for God's sakes, don't just think that doing something fast is always going to be the best way to do it, or